There are countless differences between all kinds of games. There are hard games, easy games, quick games, long games, and all kinds of games with countless differences between them. However, there are some traits that all games share. For instance, all games are inherently systemic. I plan on talking about systemic structures more in future videos, but today I wanted to focus on one systemic lens that can be used to analyze games, namely, games as systems of conflict. Without further ado, let's begin. Conflict is one of the core aspects of games, without which gameplay would not exist. Before moving on, I want to talk about what conflict is and how games create it. As we all know, games are an interactive medium, and this naturally has consequences on the very nature of games. One of these unavoidable consequences is conflict. The vast majority of games have some goal that the player works towards, or have room for the player to define their own goals. Where there is smoke, there is fire, and likewise, where there are goals, there is conflict. At a fundamental level, conflict arises when the player has a goal and some obstacle is in the way of achieving that goal. This obstacle does not need to be hard to overcome, but it just needs to exist. Whether the obstacles are hard or easy, the engagement that games can provide is created when players overcome the game's obstacles. For example, in Spelunky, the player's goal is to reach the end and beat the boss. Obviously, this is not an easy task, since the player needs to deal with all sorts of enemies, traps, and randomly generated levels that stand between the player and the end of the game. Conflict is obviously much more complicated than this, so we wanted to take a bit of time to talk about the nature of conflict in an interactive medium. Games can take many different forms and can be presented in many different ways. Since this is the case, it is important that we develop ways of categorizing games so we can identify patterns among different kinds of games and come to a greater understanding of how these games operate. One way that we can differentiate games is by identifying the agents of conflict that can be found across different kinds of games. Some games, such as chess, feature single-player versus single-player conflict, which puts two players directly in competition to defeat the other and claim victory. A similar kind of conflict is team versus team conflict, but instead of having one player fight another player, there is a whole team of players fighting a whole team of other players. Team Fortress 2 is a good example of this kind of conflict. Similar to the team versus team form of conflict, there is the one versus many conflict, where one player is alone and is placed in competition against a team of other players working together to bring down the one player. Usually, the player that is on their own is much more powerful than the other players, which forces the others to work together to bring down the one player. The forms of conflict I've mentioned so far are two-sided conflicts, but there are some games that have more agents competing against each other. For instance, there is the free-for-all, or every player for themselves, variety of conflict. A similar offshoot to this kind of conflict is the free-for-all team fight, where players have a small group of allies who are competing against other groups. Games with this kind of conflict can create environments where players always need to be aware of their surroundings, because there are several other groups that they need to keep track of. Some interesting social behaviors can also come out of these kinds of conflicts, where players might let other groups fight each other before swooshing in to finish off the weakened victor. Or, there are instances where two unaligned groups work together to temporarily work towards a common end, before finally going back to being enemies. In games with humans acting against other humans, the obstacle is created primarily by the other players acting within the game's system. That system might provide some force against the player, but the player's primary goal is to beat the other players. For instance, consider the storm in Fortnite. Yes, the system can provide an obstacle to the player that is unaffected by the other player's actions, but that obstacle is presented in the context of a free-for-all conflict, where all of the other players need to deal with that obstacle if they want to stay alive. Ultimately, the winner is going to be the player who can best utilize and work within the game's systems as a whole that is going to win the game. Of course, not all games feature player versus player conflict. Some games are centered around a kind of conflict which presents the players with obstacles primarily generated by the game's system. Of course, single player versus the system is one example of this kind of conflict, which requires the player to overcome the conflicts presented by the system on their own. Hollow Knight and Portal are both examples of this kind of conflict. Similar to this kind of conflict, there's also the team versus system conflict, which is similar to the player versus system conflict, but as the name suggests, this kind of conflict features a group of players who work together to overcome the game's obstacles. Left 4 Dead is an excellent example of this kind of conflict. Other games put players against a system where individual players compete side by side against the same system, but they cannot directly affect each other. Players competing for a high score in Pac-Man is an example of this kind of conflict. The amazing part about thinking of games as different forms of conflict is that it helps you see that games can have many different forms of conflict and can dynamically shift between them. For instance, take Portal 2. At first, you might assume that this game just features player versus system conflict, but there are actually some others. For instance, there is a cooperative mode, which features a team versus system conflict, where the players need to work together and use their combined portals to overcome the challenges. However, it is also important to note that games can be analyzed in many different contexts. Currently, we have only looked at Portal from a very formal level, that looks at the game's goals and the player's ability to overcome them, without considering the context of players actually playing the game. From this perspective, we could argue that Portal 2 has player versus player conflict. If you have ever trolled your partner by sending them flying into the water or crashing into the wall, you know what I mean. You were creating some kind of obstacle that is preventing them from achieving their goal. Hence, we could consider this player versus player conflict. There are also player-created maps that are a race between two players, which is also player versus player conflict. We can also consider Portal 2 from a larger societal context. From this context, Portal 2 has conflict revolving around several individuals overcoming a system separately in the form of speedrunning, where players compete to achieve the fastest time in the world. The kinds of conflict that a game can explore is dependent on the game's formal design. The inclusion of certain elements to the game system will influence the kinds of conflicts that can arise and which forms will be most prevalent. For instance, a game with friendly fire is going to encourage different kinds of conflict than games without it. Understanding the effects that various gameplay mechanics and systems can have over the development of conflict in the game system will help designers explore certain kinds of gameplay dynamics that can only be explored in certain forms of conflict. It is important to remember that the game should present the player with obstacles that are meaningful to overcome in order to make the game as interesting as possible. One way to think about making more interesting conflict is to present the player with two competing interests and forcing the player to choose between them. This could be accomplished by tapping into some of our core human drives. For instance, in Dead Cells, there are challenge runes that create a conflict between greed and fear by presenting the player with valuable loot, but if the player chooses to take that loot, they will need to run through a platforming gauntlet. The player's greed makes them want to take this loot, but that greed is contrasted with the player's fear that they might die or take significant damage in the gauntlet. This conflict forces the player to consider their previous actions and how this choice could affect the future game state, and use that information to make a choice to resolve this conflict. All great choices in games will have some internal conflict which the player resolves through their decision. This extends to moral choices as well. Papers, Please presents the player with conflict of security or greed through its choices. The player wants to be able to provide for their family, but doing so might force the player to carry around the guilt of turning away someone who needed help. If one choice is clearly superior than the other, that conflict is going to be completely meaningless, since there is no internal debate. I will leave some sources in the description of this video that talk a bit more about the relationship between choice and conflict, for those of you who want to dive deeper into this topic. At the end of the day, conflict is at the center of any game, and understanding that conflict is part of understanding the core structures that drive gameplay. Viewing games as conflict is another lens with which individual games can be analyzed and categorized into larger groups which share similar conflict structures. Some games have very rigid structures of conflict that aren't very likely to change, while other games can dynamically shift between several forms of conflict through the natural course of gameplay. These structural differences only make themselves apparent once you view them under the lens of games as conflict, and this shows what makes some games tick. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have made it this far, feel free to subscribe for more discussions about game design. Until next time, this has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.